Good afternoon, everybody. I am thrilled to be opening this session on end-to-end encryption. And for those of you who don't know me, I have a background in research, but it's actually in ancient literature. I have a PhD in rhetoric. So I'm very, very interested in how people communicate about particular issues, particularly hot topics in public discourse and public policy. But I left academia many years ago to go and work for law enforcement, and it's lovely to see some former CEOP colleagues joining us today. I worked as principal analyst for CEOP, then working on these issues at Europol, European Cybercrime Centre, but then I went to work for Facebook for a few years, and again, I can see some of my law enforcement customers from my days at Facebook. I returned to research because one of the things that I saw time and again when it came to online safety issues and that group of behaviours that we now call online harms was a really polarised debate. And I see that, more than ever when it comes to an issue like end-to-end encryption. It's one of the most controversial issues, I think. It's one of the most polarising issues that we have in relation to online safety. And I'm going to take you through why I think we might have got to where we've got to, and what may need to change in order for us to find some workable solutions. Okay, so if you haven't delved further into the technical and the stakeholder management aspects of end-to-end encryption, this is the kind of thing that you may be exposed to in the popular media in the UK. A statement perhaps by a senior law enforcement officer or former senior law enforcement officer saying that the Facebook plot to encrypt all chats will help child abusers to hide. And that's all well and good. There is a sense in which absolutely end-to-end encryption will make a certain kind of detection more difficult. But what do we mean by end-to-end encryption? Well, there is a fabulous graphic here with due credit to Martin Keppelman. Encryption in transit is something that already happens to most of our communications. I would say almost without exception now. And if something is not encrypted in transit, it's probably got a few problems that you need to worry about. And in encryption in transit, the data, the content of the communications is scrambled. But that central service provider, and this is the current state of play with most of Facebook's communications when you're using a platform like Facebook, is that it's unencrypted on the central service provider's servers. End-to-end encryption changes that because not only is the data scrambled in transit and therefore unreadable, but it's also scrambled on the service provider's servers. So the service provider can't read that data either. And as we will see, that proves to be a problem, particularly for content review by those service providers. We also have another option, which is end-to-end encryption, where there is no service provider. So you will have heard of peer-to-peer services. Peer-to-peer platforms, really, there's no central server, no central service provider, it's distributed computing. And in that kind of environment, there's actually no central storage, so it's completely encrypted. What you may notice from this graphic is that at the ends, the data is in the clear. So on your device, on my device, as you know, you can read that data when you're on WhatsApp chatting or using other end-to-end encrypted services. And that's important to bear in mind for any potential opportunities there might be to intercept that data at the device end. But basically, for end-to-end encryption between one device and another device, it's the impossibility, at least at the highest level, to be able to read any data that is intercepted. Okay, so how does this play out in public communications and the discussion between governments and tech companies right now? Well, I've made an extensive analysis of the communications between the Five Eyes ministers, so UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, US, and Facebook, and particularly Mark Zuckerberg. And they've written a number of letters to Facebook because Facebook is planning to introduce end-to-end encryption across its services. And it really presents two key issues in my line of thinking. The first is that end-to-end encryption prevents meaningful lawful interception. So it prevents law enforcement from intercepting those communications in a way that they can make sense of them. And that is something that clearly in this letter to Mark Zuckerberg, the Five Eyes ministers are very concerned about. But it presents another problem. And that is, as you can see highlighted in the middle here, it prevents the ability to detect and respond to illegal content and activity, such as child sexual exploitation and abuse. So it's not just that you're not able to give law enforcement access to the data in the clear. It's also that the company themselves cannot review that content in a meaningful way. And if we think about, and I feel slightly embarrassed speaking to this with Hanny in the room, but when we think about the current mechanisms for identifying known child sexual abuse material, for instance, the use of photo DNA and hashing and signatures that allow us to deliver automated detection, that relies to a certain extent, to a great extent, on being able to review that content, to be able to see what it is in order to make a match. And as far as those governments are concerned, that prevents the prosecution of offenders and the safeguarding of victims. So that's one side of the debate. The other side of the debate is quite nicely illustrated in Facebook's response to this letter. So it's a conversation, if you like, or a table tennis, a ping pong match, if you prefer. As far as Facebook is concerned, deploying end-to-end encryption is about strengthening private messaging, because without that, there is harm or abuse from hackers, criminals, and oppressive regimes. So as far as Facebook is concerned, providing what is sometimes called a backdoor access, so the encryption keys, actually weakens that system for everyone. And would be a gift in their perception to criminals, hackers, and repressive regimes. It's actually the more vulnerable and harmful approach. So you can see already how polar these perceptions are. So how realistic is it really that hostile regimes are going to conduct this kind of surveillance and make, misuse encryption keys or engage in surveillance of their citizens and other citizens? Well, actually, we only need to look as far back as last week. Some of you may have heard in the news about Pegasus spyware. That was discovered in 2016. It affects Android and iOS operating systems, so most mobile phones and tablets. And it's retailed by a company called NSO Group that is based in Israel. It engages in keystroke monitoring, so it records what you type, surveils texts, emails, web searches, phone calls, location tracking, hijacks your microphone and your camera. So it's a continuous surveillance tool. And a report published by Amnesty International last week found that at least 10 governments worldwide were using this tool, and there had been a leak of 50,000 phone numbers. Those phone numbers are in 45 countries. So potential, at least, persons of interest and potential infections, including a UK human rights lawyer, a Queen's Counsel, in fact, who had worked on the Jamal Khashoggi murder case. French President Emmanuel Macron, you may have heard about that in the media as well, but then also the murdered activists themselves, so a journalist in Mexico and people closely linked to Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian journalist. So there are real, genuine concerns that are related to the physical safety of some of these people who are subjected to this kind of hostile surveillance by their own states or by other countries. And so that means that we have the mainstream technology press pretty much saying that Facebook's deployment of end-to-end encryption isn't happening quickly enough. So it's not simply the case that companies don't want to step up to their responsibilities to protect children. We also have an equally vocal lobby saying that absolutely this must happen. So at the same time, there's a lot of focus on Facebook, and I want to unpack why there is focus on Facebook right now rather than other platforms, because there are many, many other platforms that already deploy end-to-end encryption. Skype has deployed end-to-end encryption for a number of years. WhatsApp, obviously, you will know. Signal, which if you work in law enforcement or a government agency, Signal is very much the messaging platform of choice. Telegram, that you will be aware of perhaps in the counterterrorism context. So why all the focus now on Facebook? Well, Facebook makes the vast majority of the reports of suspected child sexual exploitation to NCMEC, to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. Over 20 million, in fact, of the reports in 2020. So that's nearly 95% of the global total. And to date, at least in terms of volume, that's where the vast majority of existing leads for law enforcement on online child sexual exploitation and abuse are coming from. It's arguably too many. But if Facebook deploys end-to-end encryption, that kind of content review, that kind of detection will no longer be possible. And law enforcement is facing that leads, that flow drying up completely. But as Carl mentioned, I am a bit of a fanatic about really identifying prevalence and identifying gaps in our data. And one of the things that I'm concerned about time and again is that actually the focus on Facebook is completely right and proper, but we mustn't forget there are lots of platforms who are not obliged to report to NCMEC because they're not based in the United States. I always use the examples of WeChat and Sina Weibo and Line. If we think about Chinese and Japanese platforms that are popular, not necessarily massively popular in the UK, but certainly in other parts of the world, we don't know how big the problem is on their platforms because they're not obliged to report to NCMEC. So what we're really talking about here is the risk that an existing flow of leads, all of which may pose a risk to children or may help law enforcement identify ongoing abuse, particularly in relation to new or self-generated material, that is going to dry up. Now, one of the things that is mentioned quite frequently in relation to online harms, and is certainly in the Online Harms White Paper from 2019, is that public concern dictates that we have to take certain regulatory measures when it comes to online safety. So that prompted me to look into public concern about some of these issues. And for those of you who've worked in online child protection for a while, you will be disappointed to see that according to the findings of Ofcom and the Information Commissioner's Office, UK adults are actually less concerned about all of those behaviours that we would link to the methods of offending related to child sexual exploitation and abuse than they are about their personal information being stolen or hacked and about scams or fraud. So there's a lot of data on this slide, but if you can see where those yellow arrows are, that's where I've identified that we could have, in addition to the obvious line of child sexual abuse imagery, that we could have some link to the online victimization of children in relation to sexual exploitation and abuse. Now, I'm not saying that is, well, I'm certainly not saying that it's right that that's the case, but what I do think we should do is question our reliance on public concern, because for issues like this, it may be the case that we need to sensitize the public to something like child sexual exploitation and abuse before we can actually measure their true levels of concern. But it's a concern to me, to reuse the term, that we don't necessarily have great data, or at least persuasive data, on levels of public concern. You may see, and this is just to complicate matters further, it's a complex issue, that right down at the bottom, second from last, only 7% of adults unprompted were concerned about government or agency surveillance. So that plays into the fact that ethically, as well as technically, this is a complex issue. And you'll recognise this Sun headline from the start. News UK actually ran a poll, a vox pop here, that when you'd read the story from the senior law enforcement officer condemning Facebook's move to deploy end-to-end encryption, they ran a vote. And the vote was, do you think Facebook should encrypt all chats? And perhaps not quite as the Sun intended, when that poll closed, 53.6% said they definitely should encrypt all chats. 21.4% said absolutely not. And a quarter of people said they weren't sure. And I think that's very, very honest of them. So we end up in a situation where end-to-end encryption is somehow both the irresponsible response and the most responsible thing that we can do. It's the safest measure, and it's also the least safe thing that we can do. It's the strongest technical measure, but also the most vulnerable. And it's simultaneously in citizens' best and worst interests. So how can we do this differently? Well, this is just my personal opinion, but I think it's about time we recognised, as Vicky did at the start of this session, that the issue is both ethically complex and technically complex. But we absolutely need to challenge the prevailing rhetoric at the moment that if you're a stakeholder in this space, whether you're in technology or in child protection, you either care about children or you care about privacy. I'd like to think I'm a living embodiment that you can care about both, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problem very easily. But what that polarized assessment does is it forces us into a situation where we have to weigh the life of a child against the life of a journalist or an activist. And that cannot be the way that we can practically and effectively proceed on this issue. So we need workable solutions, either for continued content review, and I mentioned the possibility, although I'm sure Hanny will have more to say about this, on device level filtering, so actually filtering for child sexual abuse material on your phone, on your tablet, before it's encrypted in transit or after it lands. Or we need responses that don't rely on review of unencrypted content. Where we are at the moment, at least in terms of public information, is that on one side we have the Five Eyes ministers in that very same letter that I introduced to you at the start of the session, saying that their technical experts are confident that they can protect users and the public while defending cybersecurity and protecting privacy, but they don't go into any more detail about that. And we have Facebook in a recent blog saying that they've discussed with workshop participants tools that can protect people's privacy while also preventing harm from happening in the first place. But they're relying on metadata, behavioral signals, traffic data, and user reports rather than access to the content of all messages. Again, they haven't publicly gone into very much detail about how they would do that. So that's where we are. It's all to play for. I'm very, very much looking forward to the next two speakers. But for now, I will hand you back to Vicky. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Vic. That has given us real food for thought and put into context what the debate is. So I'd like to move on now to Mallory and ask Mallory to do her presentation.
So thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all and really appreciate Victoria and Hanny for joining me today. This is a really important topic. And I'm also pleased that because of the previous presentation, I don't have to spend a whole lot of time on all of the slides that I prepared, because it sometimes bears repeating on some of these things, but sometimes we can just, I think we have a strong basis of understanding now to move into some of these things. So I wanted to talk today about what is possible on end-to-end encrypted systems and content moderation that does not break encryption. And there are a lot of things. And this is also the basis of a report that the Center for Democracy and Technology will be putting out next month. So you get a preview. And so I'm happy to deliver that to you. I should back up for a second and just talk about myself. So I'm Mallory Knodel. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at CDT. CDT is based in Washington, which is where I am now. And we have worked for 2 decades on just policy on the internet, and the approach that we take tends to center the public interest. So because we work very closely with policymakers in the US and in Brussels, in fact, where we have an office, we tend to take a practical approach to policymaking, but one that takes a wide view of what is best in the public interest. So when we have these very complicated issues with lots of different interests that seem to be paradoxical to one another, that's when we hone in and we get very, very specific about what we can do to try to untangle some of these issues. And you'll notice that within, civil society advocates, nonprofits, even within governments themselves, there is debate about this. What's good for one aspect, maybe not good for another. So let's just dive in. I wanted to, just to reiterate that we're really championing civil liberties, which obviously include privacy, and that's a very firm position we have. As a technical specialist, I find it's very helpful to approach these issues from a principled perspective for what we feel is best for the public interest, but also one that's very informed by the limitations, promises, and opportunities of technology, such that we don't get too far afield in imagining what might be possible if we had magic wands, but what really is practical and doable. So the other things you might want to know about me is I've worked in this field for about 15 years. I'm also a co-chair of a research group at the Internet Research Task Force on Human Rights and Protocol Considerations. So that's where, unfortunately, it doesn't really help us in this debate, but looking at transport encryption is a big deal in that space. If you'll remember the infographic before, where you had transport encryption, service provision, end-to-end encryption, and then at the bottom, you had peer-to-peer end-to-end encryption. That would be like the very top layer where mostly we work on in the IETF. But there's also at the IETF a research group, or a working group rather, on messaging layer security, which would be trying to standardize the Signal end-to-end encryption protocol for WhatsApp and Facebook and Wire and several others. So we can also talk about that. I work in that space as well. And then lastly, there is a global coalition of civil society organizations around the world. It's really, we focus mostly on Brazil, India, the UK, Australia at the moment, and the US. But we're working to secure and keep secure encryption because of this concern with mass surveillance, security of journalists and activists, and so on, very many other reasons. But those are my background, those are my credentials. So I wanted to start actually first with a little bit of Content Moderation 101. This is the first part of the report that we're putting out. And I want to actually highlight this because I think it's not always obvious exactly how Facebook or other platforms might be doing content moderation. And to sort of first break that down gives us a basis for them thinking about what we know about how to do it in plain text or without encryption context, how we might learn from those experiences and then apply them into the encrypted context. And I think we'll see that there's quite a lot there that we can glam onto when we're thinking about solutions. So just generally speaking, I'm using content moderation to refer to not just tools, but also policies and systems that any intermediary like Facebook or Twitter or other platforms, messaging apps, that sort of thing, might use to decide what user-generated content or accounts or other kinds of data associated with accounts to publish, remove, or otherwise manage. We're not considering necessarily content moderation to be steps that would trigger law enforcement activity or other things. That sort of falls outside the purview of, I think, what content moderation. Well, we'd all hope our tech companies would not have to worry about. So the phases are actually many. The first thing is definition. You have to know what you're looking for. Then you have to detect it. There's a need to evaluate it. Sometimes there are false positives. Sometimes there are nuances, enforcement. What are you going to do with it? What needs to happen next? Appeal is very important for people who have had content removed that is not in violation of policies or laws. That's really important to have recourse to that. And then lastly, a lot of platforms spend a great deal of time in educating and figuring out ways to bring forward their policies and their practices and procedures to users so they can avoid violating them in the first place, or they can help participate when it comes to user-empowered participation in content moderation, which we'll get to because it's very important. Let's see. Yes. So now I'm going to shift to then encryption. And then at the end, we're going to sort of try to put them together. So we've already covered some of this, but I wanted to give you my take on it from my own perspective. Sometimes it's worth repeating how exactly encryption works, what it's all about. But cryptography, when it's applied to online communications, does three separate things. The first thing is that it authenticates users so that you know who you're talking to, so that if your app or your messenger says that you're talking to someone, the app can verify that that's true. Which is pretty important. Confidentiality is the part where we think of, when we think of end-to-end encryption, we're thinking of confidentiality. We're thinking of a private conversation. You can't see the context of it. You can't see the inside content of the message. The server can't see it, that sort of thing. And then the last thing is integrity. That's another important one when we talk about security and making sure that things are verifiable and that no one's getting lied to or duped. Integrity of the message content is also something that cryptography and an end-to-end encrypted system helps with. So we've already gone over this too, but encryption in transit means that when it's going over the wire, like we like to say, it is protecting the data. And the service provider is participating in that protection such that they are providing the keys or the means to hide that data. Then encryption at rest tends to mean when it's sitting on a device or on a server, the encryption that's happening is isolated to that, either that phone that you have in your hand, or if it's in some server cabinet somewhere in a data center. Now, end-to-end encrypted services, there's a little bit more involved, and I think a definition is really worth it. It's actually one of the things I'm working on in the Internet Engineering Task Force, is coming up with a way to define end-to-end encryption such that we can all have a rigorous understanding of what it is we're really talking about. Because others are playing around with ideas around private messaging may not actually be end-to-end encrypted. And if we're going to have debates about these things, we have to be clear and precise. So an end-to-end encrypted system or a service or an app uses keys. It's a metaphor, but it really just means, something that I have that no one else has. It's like a key to a door in a lot of ways. And you're advised to never copy it. And most people don't, and most apps won't let you. So again, those keys do apply those three functions. They authenticate it. They do the encryption and the decryption. The keys then are only known to the sender and to the recipient or recipients. Often we're talking about group chat these days, or most messaging apps will allow you to have more than two people in an end-to-end encrypted chat. And we're also not just thinking about messaging. We also can see these techniques used in Dropbox, which is like a storage service. There are many storage services out there. Or even in email, there are emerging now more email clients that will allow, or email clients or email services that will allow for encryption. And so we just want to be clear about what services we're covering. I also then wanted to, I'm going to take a step back, actually. I failed to make a point earlier about when I'm talking about content moderation, often in this particular report, and even in this conversation right now, we are only talking about detection. That's the second point. That's the second phase here. And so detection and what comes before and what comes after is not really what's happening right now. We're just laser focused on that one phase. And then here as well, we are going to, again, focus on detection, because we are no longer sort of having conversations about backdoors. I know Professor before talked about backdoors and used that metaphor and analogy. That's been around for a long time. That was sort of in the 90s when law enforcement agencies were requesting backdoor access to cryptography. That sort of was a blanket request, and it wasn't always well defined. But today, what we have is essentially a series of proposals, because there are very many solutions that folks have proposed, series of proposals to do a lot of different things. It's not just like, please give us access to the content that we can't see. It goes much, much further than that. So I wanted to talk about that and put that in context for you. So today's debate in how to essentially use technology to help in the fight against child sexual abuse online, et cetera, requests very, very many things. And they all are separate requests, and they all have potentially separate solutions that may or may not be compatible with end encryption systems. So the first one is we want to detect it, right? We want to, there's known, and then the second one is like, we're going to identify known content. We might actually want to identify novel content with machine learning and other things that's taking images and trying to see if that image is a picture of a cat or a dog or something that we don't want online, terrorist content, et cetera. Then there's a request to remove it. So, the platforms, if they can detect it, then need to take it off their servers, get rid of it. There have been proposals that apps should actually just prevent the spread. They should stop the spread. That's a different feature request. That is a whole different technology that would be there to stop the spread. Another one is tracking the spread. Some law enforcement agencies, like in Brazil and India, they want to know the origin. They want to track it. So they want to know more. They don't want it. They want to identify it, and they want to know, who sent it, where it came from, who else has seen it, that sort of thing. That's, again, whole other set of feature requests. Finding the originator, same as tracking similarly. And then sometimes there's a request to exact consequences, either ban the user from the platform, find their location, actually potentially pervasively surveil them with a warrant, presumably. There's a lot of things. And then I've even heard proposals that would intentionally create features in these apps that would allow you to contact actually the victim and intervene. So that is, these are all very heavy asks. If you're thinking about, WhatsApp, like it's a lot we're asking of these tech platforms to do on top of really just what they're doing is providing messaging apps. So just keeping that in mind when we're thinking about, what it is that we actually think these, it isn't as simple then as just like, oh, can I have a copy of that key? It's actually, can you build in a variety of different features so that we can make a variety of different interventions? Then I think that the things that we then evaluate in this report are very serious proposals that we sort of aggregated various analyses about, and then sort of make some judgment calls on based on, again, our purview as public interest advocates in a global context. So one that is fairly interesting is user reporting and message franking. So I'll just very quickly describe what that is. I don't have a graphic or anything for each of these slides, but user reporting would be, if you're in a conversation and it's encrypted or otherwise, really, you can report the content as being terrorist or something you don't want to see, or potentially in violation. And there are issues, though, with reporting. I imagine that if a user thought that they could potentially be in trouble for having being the possession of questionable content, they might not report it. So you have to ensure that they feel very comfortable to do so. And so therefore it has to be private. You really need to have a private conversation or ensure the user that their reporting won't actually then get them in trouble, or they won't even know who they are, which is what message franking does. So message franking is very similar to what I'm sure Hani's going to describe later, which is sort of taking a piece of content and hashing it or turning it into data that can't intelligibly be understood or traced back to the user. That's what message franking would do. So you report the message, you handle the problem, but without implicating the users, just to mitigate that. So that's one. It seems to be very promising, and also a user empowerment step, which I think is a really important part of the sort of larger context around what we're trying to do in terms of raising awareness and action with content online. The second one on this list then is traceability and enhancing metadata. This is what I said previously, that like there were sort of proposals in the legal landscape in both India and Brazil, and it's coming up elsewhere. The idea that you could potentially increase the amount of metadata or the data about the data about the message, such that law enforcement could know more about it, where it came from, and all of that. Those proposals have a lot of problems with them. One is that you're creating more data. So that is sort of, it's quite at odds actually with secure messaging, because the more sort of data you have, really like the less private and secure it is, the more open it is to potential abuse or hacking, that sort of thing. And generally is actually quite a heavy lift on the part of the messaging app, because it kind of has to just change how it entirely functions. So most, if not any, services are going to be willing to do that. So it's not one of the more viable solutions, honestly. Metadata analysis and machine learning is the third one on here, which is really interesting as a possibility, because it's similar to how platforms already deal with spam and just general like abuse of their systems and their software, which is like just constant and ongoing, and they have to figure out how to manage noise, especially. So metadata analysis doesn't require any knowledge about the content. It also often doesn't require a whole lot of information about the user either. It's just based on behaviors, right? Behaviors that maybe a machine can detect patterns in, but humans wouldn't have to necessarily. There's a whole lot of possibility around that, and it doesn't require at all peeking into anybody's conversation. And it could be, and it's already something that the platform and the service providers are often doing. They're just doing it for other reasons like spam. And we can sort of point those same tools at issues of terrorist content or child sexual abuse content, that sort of thing. Perceptual hashing and client or server-side scanning. This gets into what previous presentation was talking about in terms of the endpoints. There are some interesting possibilities there, but the one thing I would caution us all on is that the more we put on a device, actually the closer we are to the individual who is using that device. And while there may be some promising applications, it actually does put the vulnerability very, very close to the end user. So when we talk about cases where that surveillance, might be actually happening on the device because as part of an abuse cycle, or where there's not so much trust, like in Facebook, these same techniques could be applied to a variety of different applications, which, it may or may not be a good idea. Like, if we consider the proliferation of messaging apps that have different features that maybe have appeal to different kinds of audiences, where you can go from a Facebook chat situation to another chat situation. We don't necessarily want all of our apps that will be able to have access then to all of our photos. We would really not like for the operating systems of our devices to be able to have that kind of access to technology like that, or give permission, for that sort of scanning to happen, even if it's sort of done in a privacy preserving way. It just has a great deal of potential for abuse, again, like because it's a device that's very, very close to us in a sort of real and metaphorical ways. So we're worried about that one. And I can go into details if you'd like about that. But then the last one, that's another good one that we found, is predictive models, which is similar to the sort of metadata analysis, but then also classification flagging. So rather than, classification matching that then would trigger either removal or some other sort of action, actually just flagging it for the user that would then loop around to the top one, which is around user reporting and message ranking, could be very helpful. So if you sort of maybe predict models, or there's some sort of classification going on server side that says, it looks like you might be talking to someone who says they are who they aren't, or it looks like you might have content that is illegal on your phone or in this chat. Like, rather than forcing an action or getting the service provider to take action, you actually, again, empowering users to make a decision about the conversation they're having and doing something about it. Could be very useful. But generally speaking, more research is needed on almost all of these things. And these are some of our recommendations. So user education is huge. It's something that platforms are already doing, and there's just so much more work that needs to be done in that respect. There need to be more options for users to be empowered, especially in multi-person discussions, in large chat rooms or group environments, in end-to-end encrypted systems or plain text systems. There's so much that could be improved upon. We need to also we need to ask platforms if they could please focus on better accuracy and when they are evaluating reported content, because already there's a lot of content being reported. Not all of it is being accurately evaluated. There's huge amounts of improvements there that would definitely help in all of these situations. We want solutions that will increase user reports and user agency. We want to teach children and all users how to take agency over their online interactions. That's going to help everyone. Then the flagging I mentioned just a minute ago, I'm not going to elaborate. That seems, again, another way to empower. And then we've just learned so much from the ways that platforms are incredibly motivated to reduce spam for a variety of reasons. They don't want people seeing it because then they don't want to go on their platform if it's a spammy place. It uses resources, that sort of thing. It's pretty easy to apply those same things to these situations in terms of predicting behavior and getting bad behavior off, and that benefits everyone. So we want to think about more than that. So yeah, look out for this paper next month. It should be coming out soon. You can follow us online. You can write to me anytime with questions, or if you'd like to talk further about anything that I've said, I'd be happy to chat or to exchange. And yeah, these are the places you can find us on Twitter and on the internet to watch out for that report and other issues like this in the Global Encryption Coalition. So thanks again so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to any questions that you might have about these ideas. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mallory. Okay, some of that I didn't fully understand. So hopefully, Hanny, you will add to my learning now. So thank you, Hanny. If you can introduce yourself and take it away.
Thank you, Vicky. I'm Hani Fareed. I'm on the faculty here at University of California, Berkeley. And I'm not going to share slides. You may see some text over my video. So if you don't have me in speaker mode, just switch you can either pin my video or switch over to speaker mode, and you'll be able to see both me and my slides while I just talk a little bit about both Mallory and Vic sort of did a good job of setting the stage for the conversation. And I'm going to sort of hone in just a little bit more tightly on, in particular, hashing, because as I think many of you probably know, it has been one of the most successful in some ways technologies that allows for very targeted detection of child sexual abuse or terrorism content. And I'm going to talk about what does the world look like for hashing, or what could it look like within an end-to-end encrypted. And I don't have to describe end-to-end encryption because I think everybody understands now what we're talking about. I do want to just mention review what photo DNA is and what perceptual hashing is. So here's the basic way it works. You start with a database of known bad content. That can be a NCMEC for child sexual abuse. It could be the GIF-CT for terror-related content. It could be copyright infringement material, what YouTube does with Content ID. From each of those pieces of content, you extract a signature. It's a compact numerical representation of the piece of content. And then here, service provider, this can be a YouTube, it can be a Facebook, it can be a Dropbox, it can be a Messenger, whatever it is. When content is uploaded, obviously in plain text, we'll talk about the end-to-end encrypted version of this in a minute, extract the same signature from that piece of content, do a pairwise comparison against your entire database. That can be from hundreds to millions of pieces of content. And whenever there is a match, you have, as Mallory was saying, a policy decision now. So you review what's the enforcement, what's the reporting. So there's decisions that have to happen here. So this is very much that detection node that Mallory was talking about earlier. Just because it's worth mentioning, the same thing works for audio and video. It's exactly the same framework. You just have a slightly different version of what a perceptual hash is in terms of the extraction from the underlying medium. Okay, so all of this assumes on this box right here that the service provider has access to the actual content. And that has been true for a long time on things like Facebook and on YouTube and on TikTok and on Twitter, is that we have access to the content and we can extract that hash and do these comparisons. And so you've heard about and you've seen some graphics to talk about end-to-end encryption. So let's talk about that. So Vic showed you a picture not dissimilar from this one right here, where when we have encryption in transit, we have the sender. Let's go back to a messaging service if we want. That content is encrypted. I'm going to show the content in red when it's encrypted. It hits the service provider. It is decrypted. And at that point, I can extract the hash. And then the content can be re-encrypted and sent off to the receiver. So what's important here is that encryption in transit, the encryption is only happening here, but when it hits a service provider, we have access to the plain text version of the content, the image, the video, the audio. We extract the hash. Policy happens here when we have a match with photo DNA, video DNA, whatever it is. Now, let's talk about end-to-end encryption. So with end-to-end encryption, this again is encryption in transit. Importantly, the content and the hash is in green here. With end-to-end encryption, as the content goes through a service provider, or as you saw earlier, potentially no service provider, the content is not readable. It is still fully encrypted, scrambled, if you will. And now things like photo DNA, as we have been running them for the last year, simply don't work anymore because the content is not visible to us. I can't see the underlying image pixels, and photo DNA is dead in the water. Okay, so what can we do? So Mallory gave some possibilities for solutions. Let me give you some more food for thought on what you can do. So Mallory mentioned this, so let's talk about the client side. So end-to-end encryption with client. So here's basically what it would look like. So again, you have the sender, the receiver, you have a fully end-to-end encrypted pipeline. So the content comes off the sender, goes to the service provider, remains encrypted, and then goes off to the receiver where it is, of course, decrypted. So here, what's important here is where do you have access to the underlying content? So in a fully end-to-end encrypted, the only place you have access to the content is the sender and the receiver. So in a client-side version of perceptual hashing, photo DNA, the sender's device can extract the perceptual hash and encrypt that, but not end-to-end encrypted. Encrypt it as encryption in transit. So now these two pipes, the content and the hash are encrypted. Nobody snooping can detect it. Goes to the service provider. Content is end-to-end encrypted. So the service provider, that remains in red, but the hash is encrypted in transit. So it is visible to the service provider without ever seeing the content, but it has the hash. And then it can make the same policy decision. So once you have the hash, now you know whether you have a hit, make policy decisions, stop the message or not. So this is so-called client-side perceptual hashing. Has some attractive features, some less attractive features. I'll enumerate those at the very end. It is worth mentioning, however, that things like WhatsApp do essentially client-side processes when it comes to, as Mallory was saying, other types of harmful content. And I think it's worth going over to WhatsApp FAQ, which is what this screenshot is taken from. And it will tell you that on WhatsApp today, fully end-to-end encrypted, it says, for some links you receive in a chat, you may see a suspicious link indicator. That's that thing in the little blue or cyan box there. So here, for example, your messaging app has flagged a piece of content for you as potentially suspicious. And how did it do that? Well, WhatsApp tells us, I'm going to read this for you because it might be a little small. It says, WhatsApp automatically performs checks to determine if a link is suspicious. To protect your privacy, which of course is what we are talking about here with end-to-end encryption, these checks take place entirely on your device. And because of end-to-end encryption, WhatsApp can't see the content of your message. So what WhatsApp said is, look, there's harmful stuff happening on our messaging service. For example, malware, suspicious links. And so what we're going to do is on your device, client side, before things or after things get encrypted, we're going to run some kind of analysis. And here the analysis is just looking for a suspicious link. It's not looking at the underlying image or video, but it's looking at your message. It has found a link and it has done some processing to warn you of harmful content. This is exactly what client-side hashing is. And WhatsApp/Facebook is certainly comfortable doing that here. And I think that's important as we are having this conversation about client-side hashing, is that if we're uncomfortable with it, we should be uncomfortable with it everywhere. And if we're comfortable with it, well, we should be comfortable with it everywhere. All right, so that's one solution for doing perceptual hashing, things like photo DNA, is you simply push where the hash is extracted from the service provider down to the sender. Again, it has advantages and disadvantages, which I'll talk about on the last slide. But let me talk about two other possibilities for a world in which we can still do perceptual hashing and deal with the 20+ million reports each year to NCMEC, and find a balance for user privacy. Second possibility is end-to-end encryption with secure enclaves. I shouldn't have worn a blue shirt today. The text is not quite working as well. So here, what we have is we have our sender, we have our receiver, and we have the service provider. And it's the same game. We're going to fully end-to-end encrypt. So the content goes over to the service provider who can't read it and comes out. And what a secure enclave is a very special piece of hardware, computer, where it is being held by an untrusted person, Facebook. We do not trust Facebook to respect our privacy, let's say. But in this trusted piece of hardware, as the encrypted content comes in, this piece of hardware can decrypt the data and only run very, very specific auditable computations. For example, photo DNA. And it's done in a way that even if this computer is in the hands of a Facebook, Facebook cannot get access to the underlying content. That's why it's called a secure enclave. So the computations are being done in a secure computer that even if you have access to the physical device, you cannot get access to it. So this isn't quite end-to-end encryption. What it is end-to-end encryption. There's actually an intermediary here, a trusted piece of hardware where the content can get decrypted. Only specific pieces of computation, which can be auditable and verified, can run on it. And then decisions can be made and then the content come out. Again, advantages and disadvantages to this, but you can still have reasonable amount of privacy because even the underlying service provider can't get access to the content, but you still have access to the underlying unencrypted data in a very specific way. That's technique number two. And the third technique is so-called homomorphic encryption. I think I'm a mathematician, applied mathematician by training. I think this is my favorite technique only because it's mathematically so incredibly beautiful and powerful. But again, I'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So here again, we have the same game. We have content coming from the sender to the receiver. It is fully end-to-end encrypted. And when it hits the service provider, it is still fully encrypted. But it's encrypted with a very special type of encryption called either a partially or fully homomorphic encryption algorithm. The details of that are not important, but what you should know is that a homomorphically encrypted content, an image, a video, a document, a text, whatever it is, remains encrypted. You cannot read it, but you can do certain calculations on it, very, very simple calculations. And if you can encode, if you can write the hashing, perceptual hashing algorithm with just those very simple mathematical operations, you can still extract the hash from the actual underlying encrypted data without ever decrypting or even being able to decrypt it. So the idea here is that the content remains encrypted, but I can still extract a hash and then all the same policies happen after that. So that's the third technique. Okay, so let me summarize that and talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So encryption in transit, this is what we've already heard about. This is sort of, you just think HTTPS, right? Somewhat private because somebody snooping the wire can't read it, but obviously when it hits a service provider, it's accessible. Reasonably secure. Banking, we do banking all the time with end-to-end with encryption in transit, reasonably secure, and it's reasonably safe. I mean, as safe as the internet is. Okay, end-to-end encrypted. I wouldn't call it private. I think that's a misnomer. It's more private. So, for example, what you should know is even if the service provider doesn't have access to your message, they know who you're talking to. They have all the metadata. Mallory was talking to you about metadata analysis. So this is not a privacy preserving. This is just a little bit more private. Somebody may not be able to read the contents, but they know where you are, who you're communicating, when you're communicating, how often you're communicating. Surely that's not a fully private system. So let's not talk about this as it's private or it's not private. It's just degrees of privacy. Obviously it remains secure, but obviously less safe, as we have heard. Okay, and again, as Mallory was saying, as Vic was saying, as Victoria was saying earlier, how do we balance these things from repressive regimes, bad actors, child safety, hackers, et cetera, is the question. So now let's talk about the three things that I enumerated: end-to-end encryption plus X, I will call it. So I would argue that the three variations that I did are mostly private, somewhere between encryption in transit and a fully end-to-end encrypted. It's certainly remains secure, and I would say it's more safe, maybe not quite as safe as being able to see everything, but certainly more safe. And I think it finds a balance here. Now, the decision of what your X should be, we have to make some choices here. So for example, the client side, what WhatsApp does with malware or suspicious links, for example, super easy to implement. We actually know how to do this. It's actually not a big lift. There's precedence for it. We actually already do this in fully end-to-end encrypted devices. So there's, from a policy perspective and from a user perspective, that's sort of nice. There are sort of limitations to it. So for example, when you put these algorithms on devices, in fact, billions of devices, you make the underlying hashing algorithms a little bit less secure because they can get reverse engineered. So there's always a concern when you take these algorithms and essentially implement them on the device. There are ways of mediating some of that and mitigating some of that rather, but you do take a little bit of a hit here. And everything here we're talking about is just the perceptual hashing side. We're just talking about for content that has been previously identified, how do we identify it again? But it doesn't say anything about finding new content, lawful access with a warrant. This client side doesn't really help you there. Secure enclaves. What's the drawback is it requires specialized hardware. You have to get a special piece of hardware, and that can be both expensive, although we are talking about, for the most part, trillion-dollar companies. So I'm not particularly concerned about their bottom line. I would argue that the plus side here is that the hashing remains on a secure piece of device. So it's not, in fact, on these billions of devices around the world. And that's better for the security of the underlying perceptual algorithm. And because you can control what happens on that secure enclave, it does give a mechanism for lawful access beyond perceptual hashing. Obviously, it has to be done in a way that is, you don't have repressive regimes hacking into those systems and being able to put anything they want on there. My favorite, homomorphic encryption, is probably the least practical. It's just my favorite because of the mathematical beauty of it. It's absolutely more difficult to implement. You have to use specific encryption algorithms. The encryption is a little bit slower. The computations are a little bit slower. Most of those will work themselves out in the coming years because of Moore's law, which tells us computing power doubles about every 18 months or so. But there are some barriers to entry here that have to be thought about. Because, again, the hashing is happening on the server, not on the device. The hashing remains more secure. This doesn't really help you with lawful access because really all it does is allow you to implement very, very simple algorithms like perceptual hashing. So it doesn't really deal with the larger issue of lawful access. Okay, so there are probably, by the way, I've enumerated three. There are probably other ways to think about a fully end-to-end encrypted system. And then how do you do some of the things that we want to do to prevent spam, malware, ransomware? How do you deal with child safety? How do you deal with counterterrorism? How do you deal with dangerous and deadly disinformation around things like global health crisis that we have to be thinking about and have to be part of the conversation? I think Vic is right at the very beginning when she said this is a polarizing issue because people tend to come with a glass of, I'm a privacy person, or I'm a child safety issue, or a counterterrorism issue. We do have to find a balance between these things, but I do think that there are technological solutions to find the balance. And the last thing I will say here is, the only thing I would say is I don't think we should run to implement a fully end-to-end encrypted system without knowing what that is. What I've heard from Facebook over the year is, well, we have these other signals that we will use. But what I haven't heard is, well, what are they? How effective are they? Of the 20 million reports that you make every year, how many will you catch? And so we have to walk slowly here and find the balance, but know that when we flip that switch, We aren't going to be beta testing on the backs of children around the world, hoping that the technology will work. Okay, I'll turn it over to you, Victoria.
Thank you ever so much. Please, between the three of you, can you tell me in simple language, why is this important to me as a social worker working with children? Should I be concerned about this, or do I just leave it to you? Because the stuff you're saying is all way above me. What do I be saying to that child I am working with? I'm going to start with you, Vic. Why is it important to me?
So in some senses, your work as a social worker doesn't change in the first instance, particularly if you're working with a child who can show you their device. So if you're at that level where you're working with someone and they're showing you their device, the same applies to, of course, law enforcement officers. You're working on a front desk, somebody walks in and says, this has happened to me, or a parent comes in and says, this has happened to little Johnny. If you're able to provide that information, that's not so problematic. The problem comes when, for instance, if you need to go through the criminal justice system and that data needs to be corroborated evidentially. Now, you'll be aware, and I know that there are law enforcement folks in the audience who are much better placed to talk about this than I am, but I know this certainly from the Facebook and the research perspective. Using available best evidence is how we go these days in criminal justice, certainly in the UK, and whether that's law enforcement or social workers, facilitating the gathering and production of that evidence, it doesn't really matter in that sense. Where we have the problem is bringing cases to light where they might not otherwise be known. And we've heard already, haven't we, in this seminar about the fact that, it's almost facile to say we've got an underreporting problem, isn't it? So sometimes cases of ongoing abuse only come to light because of the sharing of one image by somebody on a global platform. That can uncover, years of offline abuse. Or I've certainly worked at, many cases where one NECMEC report allows you to identify that someone's been victimizing 150 children. So it's those signals that are really, that's where a lot of the NECMEC data proves its value, is uncovering abuse where someone hasn't self-reported, where it hasn't been uncovered offline. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing.
And I think that's a lot of the work that we're doing is about the fact that we're discovering abuse. It's not being disclosed to us. It's not people coming forward. Have you anything you'd like to add to that, Mallory?
So for me, I really want to focus on what you said in the very beginning, Victoria, which is that encrypted messaging is really good for children who are at risk. It's really good for everyone who is at risk. That is the point. And that if we somehow manage to convince Facebook, and maybe only Facebook, maybe it's Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp at best, and you convince them to exact some of these tools in their system, that leaves a huge ecosystem of encrypted messaging apps out there. And I was just mentioning before that there is ongoing and very productive work right now to standardize and make it even easier to spin up one's own end-to-end encrypted messaging app. That's a really important win for privacy and the public interest, because we conduct our entire lives online these days. And we need to make sure that our bank transactions and our conversations with our doctor and our social workers, et cetera, are private and secure, no matter what we're using. But that just means that then Facebook is lowering that standard for everyone else, for everyone, while we know it's quite then easy when you're, grooming or otherwise using social engineering to manipulate people to move to another app that then is, and is more niche and has all those privacy protections, and maybe even is run, by large crime syndicates, because it's actually really not that difficult to just make your own. So we don't want a situation in which the wide variety of, or the apps that are used by the most people have the least security, where the apps that are used by criminals and other people are still secure. Like, we can't put end-to-end encrypted messaging back in the genie bottle or the toothpaste tube or whatever metaphor you want to use. I think it's really important that we lean into it. We lean into giving vulnerable people access to secure and confident communications, while also then focusing on how to exact our user agency when we're online, how to be better advocates for ourselves, and to just figure out this issue of being able to report securely and actually just engage with the technology, rather than trying to break it or trying to make it go away. Because I don't think that's what's going to happen. And I think we should focus our energy in alignment with what is likely to be a future scenario, which is where everyone has what they need, end-to-end encrypted private messaging, but with.
You're fading in and out a little bit, Mallory. I don't know if it's just for me or if it's for other people as well. Hanny, I have this vision of a little black box, a little robot sitting in the middle of an encrypted stream, and this little robot's been programmed with all of the hashtags and everything else. It's got all of this on board. It's had its breakfast and it's ready to do its work, and it sits doing its work. Is that the kind of solution? That's my very visual image of what you were describing, but is that the sort of solution that Mallory is talking about, actually leaning into accepting end-to-end encryption isn't all bad, but we can get kind of some sort of solution here, or middle ground?
Good. Well, let's get a few things straight. No, first of all, Mallory mentioned banking transactions and communications with doctors, and I think that is a little sleight of hand. So first of all, if you're communicating with your doctor over Facebook, stop. Nobody talks about communicating with your doctor over Facebook or WhatsApp. We communicate with our doctors over secure portals. And nobody is saying that an end-to-end encrypted system between me and my hospital and my doctor should be tracking child sexual abuse material. Those should absolutely 100% be fully end-to-end encrypted, right? And that's how we communicate with our doctor. So that's not what we're talking about here. Nobody's talking about banking transactions, which, by the way, are not end-to-end encrypted, because the bank has to know what the message is. So banking transactions are done with encryption in transit. So there is obviously a place for end-to-end encryption with things like law enforcement communicating with each other, with me communicating with my doctor, and nobody is talking about weakening those end-to-end encrypted systems. What we are talking about is a world where children and adults share the same sandbox. And how do we secure that? Does anybody think it would be okay to go into a school and say that adults and children can go into that school unsupervised, and there are rooms that anybody can lock and nobody can see inside those rooms? I mean, that's what we're talking about in an online world where adults and children commingle. And that's what we are talking about, putting the safeguards in place. And so there, I think there are technological solutions for how we find that balance. But you want to have a private conversation with your doctor, fantastic. Get off of Facebook. I don't know what you're doing on Facebook, having a conversation with your doctor, and go to the portal that has been created to do that. But let's not mix up, what we're talking about here. We're talking about a very specific world where children, adults, and criminals are intermingling, and we don't have ability to tell who's who, and we are simply trying to find a compromise. And I think it does a disservice to this conversation to somehow say we are talking about the full world of end-to-end encrypted. We are not. We're talking very specifically about things like Facebook and Messenger and TikTok and so on and so forth.
I just wanted to very quickly point out that maybe it is the case that in England or in the US that we expect our large banking and medical institutions to have these platforms, but many don't. I know personally, I lived in Africa for about 4 years, and I did all of those things over WhatsApp because it's secure and everyone has it, and the hospitals and banks don't have it.
Great, let's create them then. But I mean, look, I'm not kidding. It's insane that you are doing this over WhatsApp. Anybody's doing this. Absolutely, let's create those portals. And as you just said, Mallory, they're actually relatively easy to create today. right? It is relatively easy to spin up a fully end-to-end encrypted system between trusted parties. So let's do it.
And that's the call to action we're talking about today. It's actually looking and focusing in on where we need to be putting our energies and how we can do this in a constructive way that will protect children. I'd like to pass over to Neil Fairbrother, who's got a few questions for our panel. Neil.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. First of all, absolutely fantastic presentations. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Thank you, all three of you. Mallory mentioned plain text systems and using metadata. But as she's a member of the IETF, she'll be well aware of our RFC 8484, otherwise known as DNS over HTTPS. Now, what that does is to encrypt your plain text lookup. So when you do a lookup on the internet using the browser of your choice, that initial lookup, as far as I understand anyway, is sent in clear text. And what this technology does, it encrypts that. So your lookups are then private. So if your lookup is www.kiddieporn.com, then no one will see that you've looked that up. Now, Mallory, it's not my work, but it's the work of the IWF, the Internet Watch Foundation. They provide filter lists for URLs that people have looked up, which contain illegal imagery, especially of children. And as far as I'm aware, according to an interview I did with Fred, who was previously the CTO of the IWF, this IETF standard, which is being supported by more and more people, including the likes of Apple, stops the IWF technology from working, and therefore it means that these illegal images can't be found. So it would be great if you've got an answer to that, because so far I've not heard of one. Victoria, thank you so much for your presentation. I thought you're very, very clear, one of the clearest descriptions I've heard of encryption. So your background in rhetoric has come to the fore there. Just a small point, really. You mentioned on-device image protection. Working on a smartphone, whilst they are very smart, they are quite hostile for developers to work in, and battery consumption is the number one thing, and you can't analyze the images on the phone, historical images anyway, because it just chews up too much battery power. So if you're going to do image protection on a smart device, it has to be, in my view anyway, in real time. You have to use the smarts of the smartphone in real time to do the analysis of the image, intervene in real time, and stop the image from being taken. And that leads on to comments on Hanny's excellent presentation. I'd love to know how you did that cool thing with Zoom, with the overlay of your images. As far as I understand it, Hanny, client-side hashing, secure enclave encryption, and homomorphic encryption, if I got that right, none of them prevent the images from being taken in real time. If it all goes back to a server, then you've got the issue of transmission of illegal images, storing of illegal images. You've got the whole Section 230 issue kicking off. Surely it would be better, despite what one of the panelists said about getting closer to the child, surely in this instance for child privacy, where we know that the biggest issue we face is the production, the self-production of intimate images by children in the locked family bathroom, surely it's better to do that in real time, because if you do it post-event, the abuse has happened, the child is at risk, and they're living with the consequences of having been groomed online for sexual exploitation. So I'm not sure if they're questions or comments, but it would be great to get feedback on those points, please.
Okay, so shall we start with Mallory? Would you like to feedback on unless before we move on to that, Vic, had you something to say about the previous conversation because you have your hand up before we move on to this one?
There's a couple of things. So one is a point that I neglected to mention when we were talking about levels of public concern, but I will save that to the end if that's okay. But just to pick up on Neil's point about the device level detection, mean, I have to be honest, I hadn't considered preventing images being taken. That seems to me to be a step beyond what we're looking at maintaining in terms of the status quo. When we think about client-side filtering, we're perhaps thinking in the first instance about preventing images being transmitted, so preventing them being uploaded to a platform, for instance. And I completely agree with you. You know, this is highly intensive on the processing side at the moment, if you were to do that on a device. But one of the things that I and others are looking at is the greater use of edge analytics and edge AI. So, you know, processing on endpoints. So it's perhaps a solution for a few years' time rather than right now. Vicky, shall I jump in with this other point? Because one of the things I meant to mention when we're looking at the public discourse and the public debate, what people actually think about encryption as an issue, is that, you know, we don't necessarily ask survivors very often.
Yeah.
And, you know, there has been some limited engagement, particularly with the Phoenix 11 in the US and in Canada. So the Canadian Centre for Child Protection and NCMEC have spoken and have reproduced quotes from isolated survivors, but it would be really, it'd be super helpful. And please take this one for free. It would be super helpful to have a more globally representative, more statistically significant response to this question from survivors. You know, what do you think about encryption? You know, do you think that global platforms shouldn't use it, or do you think that they absolutely should? And it would be so super interesting to see the results of that, but also very, very important to hear children and young people's voices.
And certainly at the top of our list, wouldn't you agree, Rhiannon? And as we're compiling our list of key topics to present to our victims and survivors groups within the UK, but also globally as we put them together. So we'll talk more about that at a later date, Vic. Don't worry about that. We haven't let that one go. Mallory, would you like to answer Neil's comments?
Yeah,
Neil's
I can
question.
respond. Thanks. Yeah, I can respond to a few. And I wanted to appreciate that study that Vic showed us all. I think also if you expanded the response from other countries, you probably would see a massive uptick in whether or not people trust their governments, because a lot of governments out there shouldn't be trusted. They act very much not in best interest, and they like to use technology to assist in state repression. I mean, also the point about, like, you know, whether or not people should be talking privately on whatever app. I mean, I'm not in the business of telling people what apps to use to do whatever they'd like to on them, but what I do want for encrypted, end-to-end ubiquitous, because our lives are rather ubiquitous online, and there's a lot about ourselves that we need to protect, not just from repressive states or potential abusers, but from companies, you know, that like to scoop up a lot of information about us. It's good for everyone. It's a public interest point. So I think the goal is to get it in WhatsApp and every, you know, banking platform. All of them should have it, right? And that's where we're headed. On the point about encrypted DNS lookup, this really hit the headlines in the UK. I know about a year and a half ago, I actually came myself to London to talk about it with British Telco and Sky and all those. What has happened to filtering? So the UK, and it's usually government-led, but often industry-led, is the biggest censor in the world. You all have lists that exceed 500 million or 500,000 URLs that are blocked, either opt-in, parental controls, that sort of thing, but it's on a really massive scale. And indeed, when you sort of hide what you're looking up from the browser or from the app, you turn off the traditional way that is then filtered. What has happened in the British telecoms, the IWF is that they could potentially follow the lead of what telecoms in Britain have done, which is to provide encrypted DNS lookup such that they are then the intermediary and can apply their filters at that time. So it's kind of like when Vic put that infographic on, it's like the top layer where you have an encrypted transit, but then the service provider, if that's, British telcos, Sky, whatever, or you as the first point of DNS query could intercept that query, apply the filter, and then carry it on if it doesn't need to be filtered out. And you can get people to opt into that. So you can give people a browser applet that lets them do that. You could apply that at the router level. You could tell, the homeowner, for example, if you want this, block list that we've put together, you could just download this this tool and it'll run for every device connected to your home router. Basically, you provide an encrypted form of lookup, but then you are consensually asking users if they'd like you to also filter it, which I'm sure what you were doing before. You just now do it with encryption. So it's great.
I can just see the business people writing all this down and thinking, right, I'm going to create this now. Hani, can I, in the last few minutes that we've got, can I let you have the floor?
So Neil, you're absolutely right. Everything I was talking about was identifying previously identified content after, in many cases, the harm has already been done. And what we are doing is slowing the re-victimization with the redistribution of the content. It is very narrow. It is a very modest step. And the reason why that's the only technology I talked about is because nothing else works at scale. Perceptual hashing works with a phenomenal accuracy and speed. It is highly targeted. It doesn't sort of get into this very tricky area of, what happens when the technology makes mistakes, and, how do we tell a 18-year-old from a 16-and-a-half-year-old? So we stay very, very far away from these really hard problems that simply we don't have the AI, the machine learning, or the technology, certainly not, as you were saying, to run on the client side on a mobile device with fairly limited computing power and battery life. So that was the reason why we focused on that. We should absolutely be having a conversation about how do we prevent the harm in the first place. Absolutely, 100%. I was just focusing very narrowly on the hashing within end-to-end encryption because this is the system that is leading to most of the reports year to year. The other thing I will add to this is, while hashing is very specific and very targeted, when you catch people trafficking in this material, you don't just get that one piece of content, but you get sort of everything that comes with it, right? So even if somebody is, for example, transmitting 100 images and one of them is known to me, I get 99 more images, right? So it can expand your intelligence a little bit more than just, oh, this is a previously identified image, because now I know these two people are trafficking. I know what other content they have. I get a lawful warrant. I can do the investigation. So think of it as sort of the pulling on the thread, if you will, to a larger investigation that can happen from just this one single image.
And I think that's a very valid point, because very often we forget that people aren't distributing just one image. It's usually a whole host. And I've heard people actually talk about the whole bit, but it's only known images. Yeah, it's only known images we're detecting, but not known images that we're chasing down. Right. I have to round this up, much to my real pain, really, because this is just developing into what could be a really good session, and it's actually prompting me to consider that we need to be doing this more and allow a bit more time for it, really. But I would like to actually quote Rhiannon in our closure here. She's actually posted for everybody to see, but I'm going to say it out loud. She said, "Thank you, Vic, for raising the need to hear the voices of the victims and survivors on this issue. I think you're right, and to have my perspective for free, it horrifies me to know that my own image might be out there being circulated. I want every tech company to do everything they possibly can to prevent this. So naturally, end-to-end encryption worries me. And it worries the Mary Collins Foundation for that precise reason. So we want to, it's a collective call to everybody to think, how can we come together and how can we be more powerful in this space?" So I'd like to say thank you to everybody. If I can ask the presenters to remain, and everybody else, please feel free to go and have a good evening, morning, day, whichever part of the world you're in. Thank you.